Hi, wonderful AP Human Geography students. This is Dr. Gillespie with a brief lecture on folk and popular cultures, folk and pop culture, chapter 7 in our textbook. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for all of your hard work. You have been amazing this year in keeping up with your assignments, and I know many of you are very busy, but I appreciate that. And you do have a holiday break, Christmas break coming up. You can, of course, catch up if you have lagged a little bit behind. That is not a problem. That's the beauty of a totally asynchronous online class, that you have the ability to work ahead or catch up after events such as debates, athletic competitions, music and dance competitions. Many of you are involved in a lot of things, and that is wonderful. So anyway, just give me a heads up if you need extra time. It is not a problem. Thank you so much. Okay, that was our commercial break. I wanted to also give you one more quick commercial break. Let's see what I did with it. Oops, here we go. Okay. If you like to get books for Christmas, I highly recommend a book by Dr. Harm DeBlay. Dr. DeBlay was a foremost human geographer. Now, he passed a few years ago, but his work is still the best known and most well-written, well-read information on human geography. This one is Why Geography Matters: 3 Challenges Facing America. And he talks about climate change, the rise of China, and global terrorism. So these were topics a few years ago that were at the head of everyone's list. So anyway, this is a wonderful book, and you can pick this up as a Christmas present or whatever. But he's a very, very excellent geographer, and we miss him a lot. Okay, let's jump into folk and pop culture. And first of all, I want to show you a little picture that I have here. And I'm talking about culture starts or begins with beliefs. What is the belief system of the people of a culture? And culture finds expression in behaviors. So the customs, the beliefs, the material traits, and the social behaviors that combine make up the distinct tradition of a group of people. So that gives us a culture. It's a combination of several things. And for an example of what might be a custom or a tradition, I would talk about the Mexicans. They celebrate the Day of the Dead, a Dia de los Muertos, and this is something that you may see, a decoration, a candy skull or a skull decorated with a lot of colorful things. This is a very important holiday that they use to celebrate those who have gone on before in their family. And this celebration keeps alive an ancestral feel for the group, in the group. They have rituals. They go and decorate their workplace, their schools, their homes. They set up altars with things for those who've gone on beyond. And they have special foods that honor their ancestors. And each generation continues this practice. That is a custom. Beliefs are things that a person or group of people believe in. They are the tenets or the convictions that people hold to be true. One example in the Old Order Amish culture is the belief in working hard and working very diligently. That is a part of their tradition and their culture. A deeply held belief is called a value. So a value is a belief on steroids, I guess you could say. Values differ in every culture, but American culture values freedom in all its manifestations. We believe in personal freedom, individual freedom, the freedom to speak, the freedom to own personal property, the freedom to vote, and the freedom to gather in a group, and so on and so forth. We have a lot of deeply held beliefs or values, and so the value that we see in freedom is deeply personal to Americans. Now, what people care about is shown in their customs, in their beliefs, and their values. What people take care of are things like food, clothing, shelter, and other material wealth. So we have what people care about and what people take care of. And you can readily see that what people care about is sort of a non-material cultural artifact or trait. What people care for tends to be more their clothing, their food, the types of housing they live in, and their artwork, their pottery, and that sort of thing. So it's sort of more the material culture. Culture is distinguished by habits and customs. Habits and customs. Habits are repetitive acts that a person performs. I would call brushing your teeth a habit. Or in my family, we take our shoes off when we come in from being outside. That's just a habit we have. But a custom is a repetitive act of a group that is performed to the extent it becomes a characteristic of the entire group. We could call celebrating Oktoberfest a community celebration in the fall that is held, and it's a custom. It's something that certain communities and certain groups of people celebrate every fall. So that is a custom. It's a repetitive act of a group performed in such a way that it's pretty much always identified with that group. So now let's look at folk culture. Folk culture is separate from pop culture. Folk culture is practiced by a small homogeneous group living in an isolated, usually rural area, but not always. What does homogeneous mean? It means one. Homo is a Latin prefix meaning one or single. It is a culture practiced by a sort of a single group of people who identify closely with one another, usually found in an isolated rural area. And this would be the Old Order Amish would be a good example of this. The scale of territory is small. Folk cultures are found in small areas and groupings. Contrast that with the pop culture. Pop culture is found in large heterogeneous communities. Hetero meaning many in Latin. So we have a culture that is made up of many groups of people and in the society. And they share certain habits. They may not be personally alike, but they share a certain habit. I would say it's a mainstream type of culture with a mainstream habit they share, such as going to McDonald's. Everywhere in the world, under every culture, you can see McDonald's, the Golden Arches. They may have a slightly different menu depending on the cultural group's food preferences and taboos, but McDonald's is everywhere. It's a part of pop culture. Even though the societies that share that habit of eating at McDonald's vary quite differently. And so we have a scale of territories being large for pop culture. We contrast folk culture with pop culture because folk culture is not mainstream. Mass media promotes pop culture, but it does suppress folk culture. So globalization kills folk culture, but global culture it thrives on mass media, it thrives on the internet, it thrives on movies and anything that promotes and puts out pop culture. Folk culture is resistant to change. It's usually traditional and long-standing. It tends to be best preserved in tight-knit rural communities, but it's very localized. So it may be prevalent in one community, but you might go downstream or down the road and not find it at all. Now, there are two forms of culture that we can talk about. One is material culture and one is non-material culture. So let's talk a minute about the non-material culture. Those are all the elements of culture that are not tangible. The term is the opposite of material culture, non-material, material. And material culture is all of the cultural artifacts that are physical things. While non-material culture exists in the collective imagination of the cultural group, it can also be turned into material culture through the creation of artifacts, the writing of books, and so on, in ways that record and store the culture so it can be preserved for the future. Some examples of non-material culture would be language, values, belief system, ideologies, the style of music they use, what they do in their free time, their pastimes, and so on. Those are non-material cultural forms. What we have material culture are the physical objects that are a meaningful part of a culture. It could include anything from buildings to clothing to tools to works of art. Here's an example. The cuisine, the kinds of food that a culture eats, their artwork, their places of worship, their religious icons and materials, their clothing. There's a hippie. And here's the clothing of a very Native American group of people here. That's part of the material culture of this group. Another thing would be dolls or toys of any kind. Those are material culture articles. Material culture is important. Why? Because it helps us understand how people lived in the past and in the present day. By studying the objects that they used, we can learn about their customs, their beliefs, their way of life. The traditional dress of a region can tell us about the climate and geography and the social structure of that region. We just look at how they dress, how they have always dressed, and we can tell so much. Material culture can also be used to trace and track the spread of ideas and technologies. For example, the invention of the printing press can be traced by looking at the material culture of different regions. You can see when Gutenberg invented the printing press in Germany, you can see as you look at the material artifacts of cultures and groups of people surrounding Germany, you can trace the spread of the printing press and through their artifacts, their books, and so forth. Every culture and even every generation has their own approach to fashion. When we look at the material artifacts of clothing, we could see back in the 1970s, bell bottoms were the rage. And in the 2010s, it went to skinny jeans. Skinny jeans were the thing. Clothing can tell us a lot about the modesty and the values of a culture. When you look at Western beaches today, they're full of two-piece bathing suits and bikinis. Or maybe in Europe, we have whole beaches where people don't wear anything. That tells us a lot about their culture and how they view what their terms of modesty are. When we go into the cultures of the Muslim areas of the world, we find that modesty commands women cover their bodies much more when they're at the beach or when they're in public or anywhere but in their own home. Toys, just as with clothing, different cultures have different toys. The Japanese love Hello Kitty, and Americans love Transformers and Legos and things like that. In the past, toys were often made out of wood. Today, they're made from plastic. So if you're an archaeologist digging through a heap of dirt and things that you're finding on a site, you could see plastic. You could say, oh, yes, I think this culture, judging from all the plastic, derived from the post-World War II era in the West. So in this, in the future, we will know and be able to locate the era just based on even the toys that are dug up and found. And magazines are another great example of material culture. They reflect the interests of a particular culture at a particular time. For example, in the 1950s, I remember seeing, we had two major big magazines that were called Life and Look. They were beautiful, gorgeous magazines with beautiful picture spreads and were very, very nice. And my parents got them, and our home was filled with wonderful reading materials. But the advertisements were of cars. Oh, they had these beautiful, huge, full-page pictures of cars, the cars of the era. And new appliances were also really featured in these ads. So today we'll see magazines filled with ads for luxury vacations, luxury cruises, and clothing, designer clothing, and that sort of thing. So magazines will give us a sort of a glimpse into the material culture of the era of the people that we're looking at. Of course, musical instruments. Every culture has their own musical instruments. In India, the sitar is a very popular instrument made of wood and metal. In Scotland, the traditional and still popular instrument is bagpipes made of animal intestine and wood. Board games, part of the material culture. The oldest set of a chess set in the world came from India, and it's about 1,500 or more years old. So we attribute the invention of chess to India. This showed archaeologists that chess is a game that's been around a long time. And by tracking the chess sets from digs around the world, we can kind of map how the game of chess spread throughout the world. Cuisine, different cultures have different cuisines. The French cuisine contains a lot of butter and dairy and cream, France is a big farming country, believe it or not, and they rely heavily on their dairy industry. Their cheeses and their creams and their butters are beyond belief. Thai cuisine, on the other hand, contains a lot of spicy chili peppers and is extremely delicious. American cuisine is a mix of many different cuisines, revealing how the culture of the U.S. is a mixing pot of migrants coming from many other cultures. Technology is another wonderful example of material culture because technology changes so rapidly, doesn't it? The first cell phone was released in 1983. Now there are phones that you can use to surf the web, take photos, and even make phone calls. By studying old cell phones, historians of the future will be able to learn about the technological advances that have been made over the years. Tools. Now, different cultures have different tools. For example, the Inuit or the American Eskimo have a tool called a ulu, which is a knife used to cut meat and fish. The Inca have a tool called a quipu, which is used to record numbers and data. By studying different cultures' tools, we can learn a lot about their lifestyles and the ways in which they interact with their environment. Excuse me, I'm getting dry. Thank you. While knowledge is an example of a non-material cultural trait, the way in which knowledge is recorded is a material culture trait. For example, the Greek alphabet is a cultural artifact of the Greek culture. The Latin alphabet, which the English language still uses today, is an artifact of English culture. So they are the way in which a language is written and their alphabet is part of the material culture. Houses, different cultures have different approaches to housing, which tells us how they live their lives. For example, the houses, if you go to Amsterdam and look at their houses in the downtown area, you'll see they're very tall and very skinny. But houses in the United States are often large and spread out across spreading and sprawling suburbs with yards and lots of streets. Each culture has their own approach to how houses are built. In the United States, you will see houses that look like McMansions, while in Australia you'll see the quintessential red brick house called a Queenslander, which is built on stilts to allow the cooling airs to run beneath the house and cool them down. Places of worship are material cultural artifacts. Different cultures have different places of worship. Mosques are often ornate and very decorated with calligraphy and intricate carvings. Many European Catholic churches are laced with gold. They have amazing artwork to demonstrate how wealthy the medieval Roman Catholic Church was. Meanwhile, Protestant churches in America are often very plain and simple, with very little decoration. And if you remember the Pilgrims and the Puritans and the people that first came over from Europe to settle, they were very basic, plain people. They did not have a lot of wealth and they did not appreciate or want to have a lot of fanciness in their lives. Monuments are one of my favorites. Monuments are a material cultural trait that is meant to memorialize a time, a place, a person. And monuments are very important to cultural groups. They can commemorate an important event or people in a culture's history. So they are quintessential examples of material culture. A cultural monument that I find very fascinating is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. It commemorates the American soldiers who were killed or went missing during the Vietnam War, and it is a tremendously moving and important monument in the American culture. We also have things called relict boundaries, RELICT. Relic boundaries are boundary lines such as walls or fences that have fallen into disuse. They're no longer important for their original purpose, and we will study more about relict boundaries and other types of boundaries when we get to the political geography section of our studies. But relict boundaries can reveal the edges of ethnic groupings, cultural fault lines, and the rise and fall of civilizations. An example of a relict boundary is the Berlin Wall, during which still stands is a memory of the split between communism and capitalism ideologies in Europe during the 20th century. I grew up during the Cold War era. The United Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, a large communist country, which has since split up into Russia, and the satellite nations are sort of on their own, basically. But when I grew up and was in school, it was the Cold War between the capitalist West and the communist country of the USSR. And we learned all about the horrors of communism. I don't think communism is taught very well today, but we certainly can see the rise of the communist Chinese into, many would say, the number one economic engine in the world very soon. They have their problems and their issues, however, but I'm just saying communist Chinese as a culture is rising quickly to the forefront to dominate the world. One other relic boundary that I know you're all familiar with is the Great Wall of China, built by the Chinese emperors to stem the Mongol and Mongol hordes coming in from the Asian plains and steppes of what is now Central and Northern Asia, and coming down in from Mongolia and so on. These people, these warriors, would come and try and conquer China and the rich dynasties of China. And they had fast ponies and were ferocious. And so this huge wall, the Great Wall, was constructed at that time to prevent that from happening. Nowadays, it's not, it's just a relic boundary. It's not used anymore, and it doesn't mean a whole lot anymore. Roads and highways are some of the most visible examples of a society's material culture. They are essential to the functioning of a society to move people and objects from one place to another. Communication and transportation are the highlights of a highly developed society. And we'll learn a lot more about that also in our political geography unit. But they can, highways and highway systems can be a good measure of a country's development. We in the United States have a sophisticated interstate highway system, which I remember when that started up too in the late 1960s, I would say. So you could see where some countries that are barely able to keep up a set of simple highways would probably be lacking in other developmental areas in their economy and society. Let's talk just a real quick second about music and food, and then probably wrap up this brief lecture. Folk music and pop music. Folk music is composed anonymously and transmitted orally through just word of mouth. Examples of folk music would be the sea chantés that sailors used to sing as they rowed or as they did their tasks on shipboard. You can't say this group or this navy or this ship full of sailors invented these sea chantés. They were just something that developed over time and were transmitted from one sailor to another, not written down. Things to do with the American Negro when he was on the slave plantation. They had many songs that they sang when they worked, and it encouraged they encouraged themselves as they worked. This American Negro spirituals, which encouraged them as even though life was tough, very severely tough on the plantation, they had a hope of a kingdom in heaven or a better hereafter. So none of these can be attributed to a particular composer. They are part of the culture that just developed sort of anonymously within the culture. Sometimes we have multiple hearths that we can pin to a particular kind of folk music. A geographer by the name of George Carney said that there are four major hearths for country and folk music in the United States: Southern Appalachia, Central Kentucky and Tennessee, the Ozark and Ouachita uplands of Arkansas, and eastern Oklahoma and north central Texas. So those are the four hearths or originating places for country and folk music in this country. Pop music is written by specific people, such as George Michaels or I don't know, think of anyone that does original pop music, and it is originated for the purpose of being sold to large audiences. Now, in the United States, the origins of pop music is attributed to Tin Pan Alley. Songwriters would write for music halls, such as in England, and for vaudeville, such as in the United States. So you could say pop music is written by certain people. Specifically, we can name the person that wrote that song, and it's produced for large audiences, multiple large audiences. And English is the universal language of pop music. All over the world, pop music is sung in English. Usually, it can be translated into a native tongue, but to be real pop music, it's still in English, even done by native performers. And I think the last thing we'll cover today is foods. Now, foods are determined, no matter where you live in the world, by your terrain, the climate you have, the type of soil you have, the vegetation that you have. So people eat plants and animals based on what grows, what is available in their particular region, and that makes sense. But there are food taboos that are rules that apply to eating food. A group or a culture will say this food is unacceptable to eat for some reason. In early Europe, the people would not eat the skins of potatoes because they thought it looked like leprosy. which was a skin disease. So Hebrew Jews don't eat animals that don't chew cud. They don't eat animals with cloven feet like pigs. They don't eat fish that lack fins or scales. That's shellfish, right? Pork spoils in warm climates. And so Muslims have a similar taboo on eating pork. And interesting, the Chinese, the people in communist China, love pork. It is a main meat on their menu, and the one of the largest, if not the largest, pork processing company in the world is Hormel, which used to be and is still located in the United States. It used to be owned by Americans, but now is owned by the Chinese communists. So it's a very important. In fact, a lot of farmland is now owned by the communist Chinese. In the United States, eating insects is considered a taboo. I would also add eating cats and dogs are taboo in this country, but not everywhere. In some cultures and some countries, eating animals such as what we would consider a pet type animal is fine. It's a taboo in this country, though. In India, many Hindus are strict vegetarians, and they don't eat cows. Cows are a source of oxen, which is the traditional work animal of people in India. Also, elephants are a traditional work animal, but Lord Krishna, in many of India's sacred Hindu texts, was thought to be a cowherder when he was a small child. Now, Hinduism is not like Roman Catholicism or Islam, where there is a strict set of rules that you follow. But all of the teachings and the sacred texts of Hinduism revere the cow and show a deep respect for all animal life. In general, a central theme of Hindu life is respect for all life. Mahatma Gandhi, you would, I'm sure, have studied. He was a legendary nonviolent leader of India. And he once wrote, if someone were to ask me what the most important outward manifestation of Hinduism was, I would suggest it's the idea of cow protection. In India and Nepal, Nepal is also a country that is greatly Hindu, I would say. Milk owns a central place in the Hindu rituals, and in most Hindu villages and towns, you'll see cows roaming free, and they're protected. In fact, you can be sent to jail for killing or harming a cow in India or in Nepal. In India's larger cities like Delhi, that has over 13 million residents, the 40,000 or more cows that roam freely are considered a source of many complaints by the people. They rip open trash bags looking for a tasty morsel to eat, and then they spread that trash freely. They also cause traffic congestion in large cities. Delhi has tried to solve the problem creatively by using and employing cow catchers. So over 100 urban cowboys catch and ship cows to places outside the city limits of Delhi. So I think monkeys are also, Hinduism has a monkey god, and monkeys also in certain cities and areas are fairly adventurous pests that are plaguing the great citizens of the city. And they find ways to control monkeys without harming or hurting them in any way. So I think we can always solve problems in a safe, creative way without causing harm and destruction, right? The last thing you want to talk about is how do folk and pop cultures diffuse. We know diffusion is the spread of cultural traits or people, whatever. Folk culture diffuses slowly on a small scale from one location to another. Um, Usually, folk culture spreads through migration of people, such as in relocation diffusion. And here is an example that I want to show you. I hope you can see this map. The Old Order Amish in the United States. Now, the largest group in the world is centered in northwestern Ohio in the Holmes County area. My family farm where I grew up is in Pennsylvania County, just east of the Ohio-Pennsylvania border, where they live and work. Several families have already migrated into this county, Clarion County, and they bought, I would say, 90% of all old farms and available farmland, and they are highly successful in cornering the real estate market. Why? Their church communities have a private bank of money that the members can ask to borrow from. They go to the church bishop, who is the head of the Old Order Amish community, and so they can borrow money without paying interest to banks like we do. They don't have the red tape of applying for a mortgage, and so they can afford to buy old farms and farmland at just about any price. And in our county, Clarion County, and you can see there's a little X on the map right here to show where we are. Most of the Old Order Amish have migrated there from Lancaster County, the tourist mecca of Amish country. And Lancaster County is in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania, and the land down there is very rich and good agricultural ground, but it is very scarce. And even the old Order Amish can no longer find farms for sale. So they're spreading out to buy land, and they settle in the marginal farmlands like in Clarion County in northwestern PA. So, pop culture diffuses quickly on a large scale from prominent nodes of innovation. Usually, pop culture spreads through expansion diffusion or hierarchical diffusion. The example I like to talk about is the role of television in diffusing pop culture. Watching TV is the most popular leisure activity in more developed countries, or MDCs, and is the most important way that pop culture is diffused across the earth today. Watching TV. Now, the public in this country first saw the television introduced in the 1930s, the old black and white televisions. And World War II stopped the television from diffusing, and but in the early 1950s, you could find television in 20 different countries. By the late 1960s, the television was in 62 countries. And in the late 1960s, it had spread to 91 countries. And some geographers actually categorize nations by TV service. And when we get to the unit on development, you'll see that television is an important aspect of judging whether a country is LDC, which is less developed, MDC, more developed, or DC, a developed country, by the percentage of the population that has a television. Well, I hope you've gotten a few extra tidbits about pop and folk culture. It was so good to have you, and I'm finishing up here just in time. There's a huge storm brewing outside. I'm at my camp here in West Virginia, and I wanted to make sure and get this done, this short video lecture done before all the storm thunder and lightning starts. So you have a wonderful day and a great week, and please feel free to post on our discussion board, our class discussion board, any questions and comments or any articles that you find relating to folk and pop culture, and share with us. Thank you so much and have a wonderful, wonderful week. Bye.